Hey there. Welcome to Student Collaboration, Connecting Roomies with Zoomies, as part of the Blending Learning, Mixing Up Your Digital Pedagogy Conference. My name is Dean Stevenson, and you will see my email address on the screen in case you'd like to follow up with me after the presentation for other information. It is stevendl@pwcs.edu. I'm an instructional coach out of the Office of Professional Learning in Prince William County Public Schools, Virginia. This is a school district in Northern Virginia, right outside of DC. For today's session, you're likely going to want the bibliography and resource list while we go through the presentation so that you can easily access the resources that we will be discussing. You can find this resource list at bit.ly/studentcollabresources, all one word, all lowercase. For today's presentation, we have two learning outcomes. The first is that participants will be able to explore ways to connect students who are in person with those who are virtual. And the second is that participants will be able to adapt strategies from in-person instruction to concurrent and virtual settings. Before we get into the heart of the presentation, I think it's important that we establish a common definition for concurrent learning since there is a ton of educational jargon being floated around right now. Concurrent learning is when there are two subsets of students, the first which is in person with you as the teacher, and the second that is being brought in through a video platform such as Zoom or Skype or something of the like, and both groups of students are part of the same class and are being taught at the same time by one teacher. Now, there are a lot of different instructional techniques that might be taking place inside of a concurrent classroom, such as blended learning, station rotations, a flipped classroom. Those all could be taking place within a concurrent classroom, but the definition of a concurrent classroom is just any situation where you are having two different groups of students in the same class, one that is in person and one that is on video. There are a lot of challenges with concurrent learning that I would bet we all are aware of since we are living that experience right now. And a few of those that were highlighted by Dr. Catlin Tucker are as follows. The first is that there's two separate learning environments, but we're expected to teach them simultaneously. The second is that when you have two different groups of students, it's difficult to engage those students at the same time. And sometimes it's difficult to engage either of those groups of students since you have too many different competing ideas going on at the same time. The third is being able to give equitable attention to both groups of students. And the last is the inability to make connections with students on an individual or at a small group level due to the number of different things going on at the same time and the inability to focus your efforts on one student at any given moment. So there are some ways that we can go about mitigating these challenges. And this comes from some of the work that's come out of our school district by my supervisor, Donna Wilder, but also some other ideas from people in the state and across the country. The first is that we should make efforts to not see this as two separate classrooms being taught simultaneously, but rather a single classroom. The second is instead of trying to think about engaging two groups of students is to focus your efforts on a single worthwhile task that can be used whether you're in person or virtual. The third is creating norms and practices that promote equity. And there's a lot that can be done here, such as having students be helpers when they're in the classroom to make sure that questions being asked online are being fielded in real time and other things like that. We'll get into those in a second. And lastly is utilizing groups that allow you as the teacher to easily monitor both the in-person and the virtual students at the same time. This list of mitigation strategies, there's a common theme across all of them. And what is that common theme? Well, that common theme is student collaboration. If you allow students to work together, it's going to be much easier to see this as one classroom because students are going to be working together. You can make one task because they'll be working on that task together. There's ability to have norms for collaborative structures so that students can be working in productive ways. And obviously having groupings relies on collaboration. And more importantly, if we're going to be working in a concurrent classroom, is the idea that we need to be doing what I have deemed crossover collaboration. And what that means is students who are in person are collaborating specifically with students who are virtual and vice versa. And the reason for that is simple. It is that it will allow for students in person to be almost like liaisons for students who are virtual. And there's a lot of benefits that could be happening when this transpires. For instance, by using in-person students as helpers, you can have them monitor chat so that you don't have to be looking at a laptop to know if virtual students have a question. You can have them relay directions that you're giving in class. You could have them be coupled up with partners who are virtual so that they have somebody that they can rely on to help them understand things if they're struggling, or can call the teacher over to clarify things if they're not understanding something but can't speak up because they're in breakout rooms or whatever the reason might be while they're virtual. The second is that if you have in-person students partnered up with virtual students, you don't have to have any of those fears about unsupervised breakout rooms, because as a teacher walks around the classroom, they can be monitoring all of the breakout rooms the same way that they would be monitoring groups if they were working in person only. And thirdly, by doing this, it allows the teacher to focus on instruction and learning over classroom management, because there's less need to be worried about what is the virtual group doing while I'm working with in-person, and what are the in-person students doing while I'm working with the virtual students. By having them working together on a given activity, you can be looking at the group instead of part of the group. So there's a few different ways that we can, in a classroom, allow for crossover collaboration, and that's going to be what we focus on for the remainder of today's presentation. Before we can discuss the strategies, there are a few assumptions that I'm making about your classroom environment and being successful with many of the strategies I'm going to talk about. The first is that all students, both those who are virtual and in person, have access to an electronic device that would allow them to do things such as get on a video meeting platform, surf the web, get into Office products, those kind of things. The second is that, as it kind of was alluded to in the first, is that all students have access to a video meeting platform that has breakout room ability. Now, not all strategies need breakout rooms, but it is definitely useful for when you want to do some strategic grouping to have the ability to use breakout rooms. So you'll notice that Zoom, Teams, WebEx, and Adobe Connect, they all have breakout room features, but unfortunately Skype does not. So if your school is using Skype, a lot of these you're going to have to think about different ways to do the activities, since you will not be able to use breakout rooms. The third is that there's roughly a 1 to 3 student ratio of students who are in person and those students who are virtual. If you only have one student who's in person and 29 students who are virtual, a lot of these strategies aren't going to make a lot of sense, because the only way you'd be able to do crossover collaboration would be if the one in-person student had the 29 virtual students in their group, and that clearly would not work. Now, could you get creative? Sure. And have some all virtual groups? Definitely. But this is ideally going to work when you have roughly 3 virtual students for every one person in person. And lastly, this is not required, but it would be preferred, is that the students who are in person have headsets that also have microphones. And the reason for that is simple. When students are working in breakout rooms, you want them to all be able to have open discussions, but if the students in person don't have headsets with microphones, they would not be able to participate in that discussion. If they just had their laptops on, you would have 8 different conversations kind of taking place, and it might be hard for students to hear their specific conversation. If they just had headsets without microphones, obviously they would be able to only hear and not be able to communicate with the group. So if students in person have headsets with microphones, that would be very beneficial to allowing breakout rooms to be as effective as possible. So when we're doing student collaboration, I've broken down some strategies into 3 themes. The first is strategies that utilize a shared screen feature. The second is when we go about sharing files as a group. And the third will be about ways to collaborate without having to share screen or share files. So other ways that we could allow for this crossover collaboration that don't require students to be kind of in a video meeting platform. So we're going to get into those at this point. So the first is shared screens. And shared screens are a pretty common way to go about collaborating, where you allow one member of a group to go about sharing their screen so that the rest of the members of the group can see what they're seeing at the same time. So in student collaboration, you would allow one student to be the person who shares their screen, and they would collaborate as a group, and then kind of the person who is sharing the screen would be the person who is perhaps inputting the information into the activity. So there's a few aspects of this that kind of set shared screen as its own category. The first is that you're likely going to want to use breakout rooms for this, since each student who is the lead for their group is going to want to share their screen. The second is that you have this student who is called the lead, while other students may have different roles, but the lead would be the person who's expected to share their screen at a minimum. And lastly, the students are going to collaborate through their discussion in their breakout room, while the lead is the person who actually inputs the end result of that conversation into the activity. Now, this type of collaboration can be very useful because many of the platforms that you already know how to use may be easily adapted to be worked in a collaborative environment by just allowing students to use a share screen. Some different examples of platforms that may be useful would be things such as Canvas, Kahoot, Seesaw, Desmos, Nearpod, Quizzes, Edpuzzle, GoFormative. These are all platforms that we've used sometime where we've had students working, and it would just be a quick little fix to allow students to work in groups on these same activities by using the shared screen feature. Now, we're going to spend a little more time on the shared screen section of the presentation. You'll notice that there's 4 sections to the screen currently that are blank. And the reason for that is that I'm going to discuss 4 different types of files that students could be sharing in their group and could be working on all at the same time. Now, in shared files, a student doesn't need to share their screen because all students are in the file itself. So you may or may not be choosing to use breakout rooms, though I would think a lot of these activities are going to be more fruitful if students can be having discussions while they're working on the activity itself. So in that sense, they would want to be in breakout rooms. The second is that the assignment of roles is not necessarily needed since all students are going to be working on the activity, though there's a lot of research that shows assigning roles is helpful in making for productive collaboration. And the last thing is that the discussion is what is allowing for the collaboration and kind of that dialogue that then leads to a final product in the file itself. So that's where that collaborative nature is coming in, is they're actually producing the file all together. So not one student has kind of final say on it, but rather they're all working together to produce the product. So from here, we're going to talk about several different types of files you could share and allow students to do crossover collaboration. The first is a pretty simple one, which is the use of a Google Doc or a Microsoft Word document that is shared amongst the group members. So within Word or within Google Docs, you can share the link to a file, and as long as you have set it up to allow for editing, all members who are given that shared file will be able to write on that Word document. Now, as the teacher, you can go about doing these shared documents in a couple different ways. The first is you could create the document for the groups and share it with the specific members that are in each group. So that way you have access to all those documents. And the document you share out might be blank and you've given directions on what you want them to create, or your document might be a template, a table, a graphic organizer. It could be a lot of different things where you're asking students to fill in that information. The other way is you could have students produce the document, or they could download, let's say you've posted a link to your Word document on your learning management system, Canvas. They could download it, and then they share it with their group members and you as the teacher. So that way you've only had to post one file, you don't have to keep track of everything, but then they're going to come back and share it with you. Now that sharing feature is obviously really important because both Word and Google Doc will update in real time if you're working in a shared file. So you can look and watch what students are doing at different places from your laptop or as you walk around the group. There's a lot of different ways to monitor what's going on in that collaborative situation because all of this information is going to update in real time and you'll have access to it as long as the file has been shared with you. The second type of file you may choose to share with your students would be Google Slides or Microsoft PowerPoint, so some sort of slide deck-like platform. And there's a lot of powerful benefits to using a slide-based presentation, mainly the idea of how graphics can be built more easily in a PowerPoint or in a Google Slides over in a Word document. So not only that, but a lot of different vendors have now started producing free templates that you can take as long as you're okay with it saying something like, this was produced by so-and-so or copyright so-and-so on the screen. So what you'll see on the screen right now is a template that I built using Google Slides. And all I've done is I've made a bunch of copies of the same template so that students could go into the template. I share this one file with my entire class. They find whatever group number they are, and then they can work on that slide. And now because I know some teachers may have concerns about well, what if one student messes up the wrong slide or whatnot? Be at ease because there's actually ways to track information such as who's edited the file, those kind of things. So you can track changes and know which student has worked on something if that was to happen. Now, hopefully we always want to give positive presuppositions. Students are going to do what's asked of them and they're going to do it well. So hopefully we won't have to worry about any of those issues. Now, some cool little tricks here. You'll notice that all these group numbers are here. Those are just page numbers. So slide numbers, excuse me. So I've just used slide numbers so that every time I duplicate the slide, it changes that number. And so it's very easy for me to produce 30 copies of the slide or 5 copies of the slide, however many I need for my class. Then I can share this file the same way I do with a Word document or a Google Doc, and students jump in the file, and I can, just like I do with other types of platforms, I can be just monitoring those thumbnails of the slides to see what's changing, and I can be looking, oh, okay, group 3 might need my help because I haven't seen a lot of stuff happening there. And so it becomes super easy to monitor what my students are working on in this shared file. The third, which may not apply to all school districts depending on what software you use, is sharing smart files through what's called Smart Suite. And what's very cool about sharing smart files is a lot of teachers, at least in my district, utilize smart notebooks to build their presentations in class, and were really at a loss when they didn't feel like they could allow students to play with them. They didn't have a lot of movable objects, those kind of things. Well, Smart Suite allows for exactly that. So let me take you into what a Smart Suite file might look like. So here's a presentation I built in Smart Notebook, and I've uploaded it into my Smart Suite. Now, there's a couple different tables going on. There's a bunch of green blocks. There's all these different things. Well, what I've done is I've locked the tables and the paragraphs using a right click and just hitting lock in place, which is a very easy feature to find in Smart. But I've left all those green blocks as movable. So I can share this Smart file through Smart Suite with my class. Every student would get a copy of it the same way they do in Nearpod or in Desmos or whatever, and they can manipulate the green blocks, which is the whole goal of the activity, while not being able to move anything else on the screen. So I've now built a slide that is interactive for my students, and similar to Nearpod and Desmos, though not as user-friendly, I can monitor all of the different pieces of information, all the different students, what are they doing, those things. Now, I can do this as an individual activity, or I can do this as a collaborative activity, which obviously this is focused on student collaboration. So what I can do is I hit this, make this page a collaborative workspace activity. I can assign students to teams, and then they get one file, as seen on this page, for their group, but everyone can manipulate it. So this can allow for, let's say you want to do an organizational activity where you want your students to put things into different piles, and they can, as a conversation, talk, discuss, make contrasts, do whatever they need to do to make that activity work for them. So again, this is called Smart Suite, and it just takes smart files you've already built and uploads them, and then allows them to be shared so that students don't need to have accounts. They just put in their name, those kind of things. So it's a very user-friendly. They don't need to have smart notebook files. If you'd like to learn more about that, because I'm not here to give a tech session necessarily, but you can go to smarttech.com/smartlearningsuite, and you can learn more about it. This is also in the resource list if you have that file open. Lastly, something that maybe we don't think about sharing, but that can be very useful, would be Zoom whiteboards. Now, you've likely put out a Zoom whiteboard at some point, or a different platform. I said Zoom, but it could be, wherever a whiteboard can be utilized in any platform, and have written on it for your students to see. But have you considered using whiteboards as a way for students to collaborate? So you can go in, and obviously this is a beautiful screen where I was just letting students play just to make sure they knew how to use the tools within the whiteboard feature. So they were just playing with the different buttons, draw, stamp, etc., etc. But what this can do is a very powerful way for students to get ideas on paper, or to make a very quick brainstorm. Let's say you don't have an activity ready, to have them collaborate, but you notice they need to collaborate and you want them to have that opportunity. So you can put them into breakout rooms. One of the students can be the lead. They can hit share whiteboard, and now they have an opportunity to collaborate. Now, if you've played with whiteboards before, one of the things that are tough is how do you then discuss these things if you want to as a whole group or whatnot. If you'd like to think about how do you actually have students work in whiteboards as groups, and then use the information from their whiteboards as a basis for whole group discussions, or submit those whiteboards or whatnot. I've actually built a little video that I'm not going to go through today, but might be useful for you, which you can find at bit.ly/ZoomBOWB. breakout whiteboard. All right, and that video is about 8 minutes long, and it just talks about how you can use whiteboards in small groups within breakout rooms, and then have it all come back together and have discussions around that as a whole group. So those are the 4 types of files that I wanted to discuss as part of today's presentation, but I'm also aware there are definitely other types of files you may want to share in your classroom. For instance, a business teacher may want to share an Excel or a spreadsheet document. And that's completely acceptable ways to collaborate. You just need to be creative on how do you adapt what we've discussed today into those types of documents so that students are still having worthwhile discussions and able to collaborate in meaningful ways in those documents. The last type of collaboration I'd like to talk about today is how do you go about letting students collaborate without needing them to share screen or share file. And there's a lot of ways we can do that. And the ideas would be similar to the previous categories, but maybe slightly easier to implement as a teacher. So for instance, if you're going to do this without needing to share screen or share a file, you don't really need breakout rooms. Students can collaborate without sharing. So in other words, they can just access where they need to be, and then they can be discussing with one another without needing to go into a breakout room. The second is they may have a role, they may not. So there's a lot of flexibility in how you go about these kinds of activities. And thirdly, the collaboration is through the discussion. So I want to be really clear here. What's kind of different between shared files and this type of collaborating is that in shared files, there was an end product. So the students were collaborating through a discussion of some type in their breakout room and producing a product that they are then going to submit. In these types of collaborating without sharing, it's really the discussion itself that is the collaboration, right? They may be taking the discussion and going somewhere with it down the road, but really in these types of activities, there's only the collaboration in getting their thinking and their reflecting going on. So it's about the discussion taking place during the activity. So there's a lot of different ways that you can go about having discussions and allowing students to collaborate without having to be in a breakout room. The first is some of the things that we just discussed. So those Google Docs and those PowerPoints and whatnot, if you structure those slightly differently, they become an environment where a brainstorming session may be happening where it's just about having discussions with one another on paper. The second is the picture that you see on the screen, which is of a Padlet, where students could perhaps be answering a prompt, and then the students are collaborating by responding to what they're seeing other students put on there, or maybe guessing at why they posted what they posted. There's a lot of ways to have collaboration and discussions taking place through a Padlet. Similarly, if you're a Google school, you may use Jamboard, which is very similar to Padlet. You can also bring in video if you want students to kind of have practice in getting to connect with each other and actually see one another's faces. You can use video recording platforms such as Flipgrid. Similarly to how you would use a Padlet, you can have students have discussions in their Flipgrids. You can record comments in response to people who have posted their Flipgrids. There's a lot of ways we can be creative in allowing students to collaborate and actually have connections with one another without needing to put them in a breakout room and having a live discussion. You could also utilize something such as a voice thread, which is similar to Edpuzzle and other platforms where pretty much there's a presentation taking place and you can add in comments as somebody viewing it, and there can be discussions taking place throughout that presentation. So it'd be really important to make sure that your presentation has opportunities for students to have dialogues over it being about like recall a fact, you know, what did slide 7 say or something like that. That would not be a very useful way because there's not really a lot of collaboration going on there. But if you asked, you know, what is the biggest takeaway from the first few slides in your perspective, and what might be your response to a student who actually disagrees with that? How can you defend yourself? Well, now you've turned this presentation into a dialogue that students can actually be collaborating within. And then what you should notice is that a lot of this is all about discussion. So clearly there's also the ability to use just discussion boards itself. So within your learning platform, You may have a discussion board feature, such as in Canvas, we have discussion boards built right in, but other LMSs, such as Schoology, also have discussion boards. And in those discussion boards, you can be putting in prompts where students are dialoguing and thinking about ideas and coming back and providing evidence. And there's a lot of ways that they can be collaborating and having discussions. You can also set discussion boards in Canvas to be group-based. So only students in the group get to see that discussion board. So if you want students to be working on a project, they can be in the discussion board and only their group mates can see what they're discussing. But you as the teacher can be monitoring those discussion boards and making sure that the progress that you want them to be making is actually being made. So if you'd like a cool twist to doing any of these kind of collaboration without sharing activities, maybe you could think about how do you implement a discussion while a synchronous activity is taking place. So perhaps you're presenting some information about a topic of interest, and students are posting in real time on Padlet what questions they have about what you're saying or what they thought was interesting, and students are kind of corresponding back and forth during the synchronous activity. They call this a back channel conversation, and there's a link to about back channel conversations in the bibliography if you'd like to read more about it. But what I want you to think about is how powerful this can be. When you're working on things, a lot of times what you're doing as an adult is you are reading and you're highlighting and you're taking notes in the margin and you're giving yourself reflective moments and reminding yourself of things that are important. Well, by using back channel conversations, what you're doing is you're giving students an opportunity to learn how to do just that. They have to be listening to the presentation that's being had or whatever the synchronous activity is, and they need to be reflecting in real time to make sure that they're having some reminders of what they thought was important. And by having them write it, even if they, don't revisit that little moment of writing it down will make it stick out to them in their mind. So give a back channel conversation a chance, and you might find it's really powerful in what kind of dialogue and discussions can take place after your after your synchronous activity. So just a reminder, if you'd like to access the bibliography and resource list, if you hadn't done it at the start of the presentation, here's the link again, bit.ly/student-collab-resources, all lowercase, all one word. And to come around and close up this presentation, I want to leave us with a couple thoughts that I think will be really useful about understanding why embedding opportunities for students to collaborate is important, not just today, but moving forward in any learning environment that we have. The first is that research has shown time and time again that collaboration is fundamental to learning. And when you've interviewed for any teaching job, they probably either asked you a question or you put in your response something about collaborating and allowing students to collaborate and work together. What you might not think about is, why is that so critical? Sure, there's this whole in the real world you have to work with others aspect. But what's more important in my perspective is how it actually helps us learn. When we collaborate, what it's doing is it's giving us informal opportunities without a grade really attached to the discussion itself to think, to put out our thinking, to reflect on our thinking, to analyze others' thinking. There's so many powerful moments that take place when we allow students to collaborate that we may never see on a report card or see in a final product, but that is critical to helping students develop what they understand about a topic. The second is we're working in a world right now where isolation is on the rise, right? Like, not just because of the pandemic, which is clearly a large part of it, but also we see with technology, students can get into their own worlds. They don't need to communicate as much in real time to have a worthwhile afternoon. They don't see those opportunities as frequently. So giving them chances to have an ability to discuss ideas with their peers and to think is useful not just for learning, but also for their social skills and for every other aspect of what creates a well-rounded individual. So it's really critical right now and moving forward that we continue to find ways to allow our students to collaborate. And I hope, while we're working in a concurrent classroom, to find ways for them to do crossover collaboration. So I want to leave you with a question, because I think it's really important that we not just think about this, but we turn it into action. So what will be a way that you will allow for your in-person and virtual students to collaborate in an upcoming lesson? With that said, I'll leave you with my name and my email again. Again, it's stevendl@pwcs.edu. If you'd like to think about these ideas, or if you have questions about resources or anything like that, feel free to reach out. I hope you guys have a great conference, a great day, and good luck as you finish up the school year and moving into the next school year.